500 meters. That was all it took to turn confidence into catastrophe. On the morning of July 1st, 1916, thousands of British soldiers stepped out of their trenches, believing the enemy had already been crushed. A week of relentless artillery had pounded the German lines. Commanders were certain the defenses were shattered. The breakthrough, deadliest, was inevitable. Instead, within minutes, carefully ordered ranks dissolved under machine gun fire. By nightfall, 57,000 men were casualties, the bloodiest day in British military history. How did months of planning collapse in a matter of hours? And why did overwhelming firepower fail? To understand those 500 meters, we have to go back before the Somme, before the assault, to a war that had already become immovable. By 1916, the Western Front had hardened into a continuous system of trenches stretching for hundreds of miles from the English Channel to Switzerland. Barbed wire, deep dugouts, and increasingly powerful artillery transformed the battlefield into a fortified killing zone. What commanders in 1914 had imagined as a war of movement became a static struggle where both sides faced each other across narrow strips of devastated land. Machine guns dominated open ground, and any large-scale advance across no man's land risked annihilation before reaching the enemy trenches. Military doctrine, however, remained rooted in 19th century experience. Leaders had been shaped by the legacy of Napoleon and the Franco-Prussian War, conflicts that emphasized decisive, offensive action. Offensive spirit was still believed to be the key to victory, yet technology had overtaken doctrine. The combination of rapid-fire weapons, dense wire entanglements, and defensive systems built in depth made frontal assaults disastrously costly. Previous Allied attempts in 1914 and 1915 to break the stalemate had failed. Still, commanders prepared a new coordinated offensive, a big push that they hoped would finally rupture the German line. The strategic situation worsened dramatically in early 1916. On the 21st of February, Germany launched a massive assault against the French fortress city of Verdun. The German objective was attrition, to wear down and bleed the French army until it collapsed under the strain. The scale of the fighting was immense, and by mid-year French forces were under extreme pressure. The Somme offensive, originally conceived as a joint Anglo-French operation, now became essential to relieving the British were compelled to assume a greater role and to launch the attack earlier than planned in order to divert German forces. Relieving pressure on the French became the first objective of the Somme offensive, followed by the aim of inflicting heavy losses on German armies. The operation would take place along a 25-mile front where British and French lines met on the river Somme in northern France. Confidence rested on the belief that coordinated artillery and infantry assaults could achieve what previous efforts had not. The plan depended above all on overwhelming bombardment to destroy enemy defenses before infantry advanced. On 24 June 1916, British guns opened a 7-day preliminary bombardment intended to obliterate German trenches, cut barbed wire, and neutralize enemy artillery. Over 1.5 million shells were fired during that week. Commanders believed the enemy would be so shattered that infantry could advance behind a protective barrage and occupy the ruins with minimal resistance. Yet the guns were too thinly spread for the scale of destruction required. Many shells were shrapnel ineffective against concrete shelters, and as many as 30% failed to explode. In numerous sectors, the barbed wire remained intact, and German defenders survived in deep dugouts, waiting. Despite these vulnerabilities, the offensive proceeded as planned. Cavalry units stood ready to exploit the expected breakthrough into open country beyond the German lines. The entire strategy rested on a single assumption that the bombardment had done its work. At 7:30 a.m. on the 1st of July, 1916, 14 British divisions rose from their trenches and advanced across no man's land along a 25-mile front on the River Somme. Minutes earlier, mines had detonated beneath German positions, including the explosion at Hawthorne Ridge, which had been fired 10 minutes before 0 hour and inadvertently warned the defenders that an assault was imminent. For 7 days, artillery had pounded the German lines. Over 1.5 million shells were fired during that preliminary bombardment, and in the final hour before the attack, nearly 250,000 shells fell in a storm so intense it was reportedly heard in London. Commanders believed the defenses had been destroyed. The infantry were expected to follow a lifting barrage that would shield them as it moved forward. Instead, in most sectors, they were unable to keep pace. When British artillery shifted to new targets, German soldiers emerged emerged from deep dugouts that had survived the bombardment. Many of the shells had been shrapnel, effective against troops in the open but largely useless against concrete shelters, and as many as 30% failed to explode. The barbed wire in front of German trenches often remained intact. From fortified positions on higher ground, machine gunners opened fire. One German machine gunner later described the moment, "They went down in their hundreds. You didn't have to aim. We just fired into them." British troops advanced in ordered lines, dressed as if on parade, according to one observer, and were met by rifle, artillery, and machine gun fire that swept through their ranks. The combination of intact wire and concentrated fire turned no man's land into a killing field. Lieutenant Alfred Bundy captured the horror of that advance. "It was a veritable inferno," he wrote. "Suddenly, an appalling rifle and machine gun fire opened against us, and my men commenced to fall. Bullets were forming an impenetrable barrage, and exposure of the head meant certain death. Dropping into a shell hole, he found himself pinned down, hearing pitiful groans and cries of pain from all directions. The carefully structured assault dissolved within minutes under the weight of defensive fire. The battlefield the following morning revealed the scale of the destruction. George Coppard, observing through binoculars, described hundreds of dead strung out like wreckage washed up to a high water mark. Many lay tangled on the enemy wire, like fish caught in the net, evidence that there had been no gaps through which they could pass. The German faith in mast wire and machine guns had paid off. By nightfall on the 1st of July, the British Army had suffered over 57,000 casualties, including nearly 19,000 killed, the bloodiest day in its history. In most sectors, the attack had been a devastating failure. Despite the catastrophe of the 1st of July, the offensive did not stop. With the French army still under immense pressure, there was no question of abandoning the Somme. Between the 3rd and the 13th of July, renewed attacks resulted in a further 25,000 British casualties. The strategy shifted gradually from expectations of immediate breakthrough to a grinding struggle for individual objectives. Each ridge, wood, and fortified village became the focus of concentrated assaults. The battle that had begun as a promised rupture of the German line evolved into a prolonged war of attrition. On the 14th of July, 4 British divisions launched a dawn assault on Longueval Ridge. Supported by intense artillery preparation, they achieved surprise and captured the ridge by mid. Such local successes demonstrated that adaptation was occurring. The Somme offensive would ultimately include 12 separate battles, many lasting weeks, and characterized by repeated attacks and German counterattack. Progress was measured not in miles but in yards. The landscape disintegrated into mud, shattered timber, and cratered earth. Innovation slowly emerged from necessity. In the southern sectors, creeping barrages were employed with increasing effectiveness, providing a moving curtain of shells in front of advancing infantry. Some divisions rehearsed attacks on replica trench systems and emphasized specialist roles such as machine gunners, trench mortar crews, bombers, and organized mopping-up parties to clear dugouts. These developments reflected what scholars later described as a steep learning curve in modern industrial warfare. On the 15th of September, during the attack on Flers, tanks were introduced for the first time in support of infantry. Though they advanced approximately 1.5 miles, they failed to produce a decisive breakthrough. Still, their appearance marked a technological shift. The Somme had become not only a battlefield but a laboratory for new methods and weapons. The cost of these months of fighting was staggering. When the offensive ended on the 18th of November 1916, the Allies had advanced only about 7 miles, roughly 12 kilometers, at its deepest penetration. The British Empire suffered approximately 420,000 casualties, the French nearly 200,000, and German losses were at least 450,000 to 500,000 killed and wounded. Entire battalions had been reduced to fragments. Many communities in Britain were plunged into grief, particularly those that had raised PALS battalions, whose losses on the first day became emblematic of the battle's human cost. For German forces, the Somme also inflicted severe strain. One German officer described the battle as the muddy grave of the German field army, a recognition that the army never fully recovered from the loss of so many experienced junior and non-commissioned officers. By the spring of 1917, Germany withdrew to the shortened defensive position known as the Hindenburg Line, a move directly linked to the troop shortages caused by the Somme fighting. The promised breakthrough never came, but the battle reshaped armies, tactics, and expectations, leaving behind not victory, but transformation. When the guns finally fell silent on the 18th of November 1916, The Allies had advanced roughly 7 miles, about 12 kilometers into German-held territory. There had been no decisive breakthrough, no cavalry exploitation into the open country as once imagined. Instead, the Battle of the Somme became a symbol of the immense human cost of industrial warfare. The British Empire suffered approximately 420,000 casualties, the French nearly 200,000, and German losses were at least 450,000 to 500,000 killed and wounded. Entire communities in Britain were plunged into mourning, particularly those that had raised PALS battalions, whose losses on the first day came to embody the battle's tragedy. For many, the Somme exemplified the futility and slaughter associated with the First World War. Yet the battle also fulfilled strategic objectives. It relieved pressure on the French army at Verdun at a moment of extreme crisis. Abandoning the offensive would have risked fracturing Allied unity. Moreover, the German army suffered such heavy losses that in the spring of 1917, it withdrew to the shortened defensive position known as the Hindenburg Line, a direct consequence of the Somme fighting. One German officer described the Somme as the muddy grave of the German field army, acknowledging the lasting damage inflicted on experienced formations. The battle force transformation. New tactics such as creeping barrages, improved artillery coordination, specialization of infantry roles, and the first deployment of tanks laid foundations for later successes in 1918. More professional and adaptive army emerged from the ordeal. The Somme did not win the war in 1916, but it changed how modern wars would be fought. It stripped away illusions of romantic heroism and exposed the brutal realities of industrial conflict. For a few hundred meters of ground, 57,000 men fell in a single day. Was it a catastrophic failure or the painful beginning of military adaptation?